1. The house on Maple Street. The house at the end of Maple Street had always been a source of eerie curiosity in the town. Overgrown vines crept up the sides, and broken windows let the wind whistle through empty rooms. No one could remember the last time it had been occupied, but the old woman who lived nearby swore she'd seen people in the windows during storms. She claimed it was the spirits of the family who had lived there. Bizarrely, they had disappeared without a trace one summer night. Mark, a skeptical teenager, decided to investigate. He crossed the creaking porch, the door swinging open with a low groan. Inside, everything was covered in dust, except for a single table in the center of the room, on which a framed photograph Saturday. Mark picked it up. The image was of a young couple with two small children, but their faces were scratched out. As he set the picture back down, a faint whisper crept into his ears, "Leave before it's too late." He spun around, but no one was there. The hairs on his neck stood up as an overwhelming sense of dread filled the air. Then, as though the house itself was alive, the floorboards beneath him groaned loudly, and the door slammed shut. The whispers began again, but now, they seemed to be coming from the wall's point too. The midnight caller Lena's phone had started ringing at precisely 12:03 every night. The caller ID would show unknown number, and when she answered, all she could hear was shallow breathing. At first, she dismissed it as a wrong number or prank calls, but when the calls persisted, she grew unnerved. One evening, after the 8th call in a row, Lena snapped and demanded, "Who is this?" The line went silent for a moment before a voice, strained and whispering, replied, "I'm standing behind you." Lena spun around, her heart racing. There was nothing. The room was empty. Her breathing slowed, but the phone rang again, and this time, she refused to answer. That night, she couldn't sleep, the sounds of breathing echoing in her mind. At 12:03, the phone rang once more. Hesitantly, she glanced at the screen and saw a text message from the unknown number, "I'm closer now." Her breath caught in her throat as she turned to see a dark shadow standing at the foot of her bed. Point 3. The reflection. Anna had always loved antiques, so when she found an ornate mirror at a local estate sale, she couldn't resist buying it. The frame was intricately carved, and it seemed to gleam with a life of its own. She hung it in her hallway, admiring its beauty. But after a week, something strange began happening. Each time Anna passed the mirror, she could have sworn her reflection didn't quite match her movements. One morning, she stood in front of it, brushing her hair, when she saw her reflection smile. Although she had not, the smile grew wider and more menacing. Anna stepped back, heart pounding, but her reflection stayed frozen, eyes locked with hers. Over the following days, she noticed the reflection began to move independently, turning its head while Anna remained still. Then, one evening, Anna walked by the mirror only to see her reflection standing motionless, staring at her with dark, hollow eyes. The figure's lips twisted into a grin, and in a voice that wasn't hers, it whispered, "I'm free now, and so are you." 4. The Forgotten Room. James and his friends were daring and fearless, often venturing into abandoned places in search of thrills. But the old mansion at the edge of town had always been off-limits, until one autumn afternoon when they decided to explore. The house was massive, with peeling paint and shattered windows that let the wind howl through empty rooms. They made their way through the rooms, joking and laughing, when James spotted a door partially hidden behind an old tapestry. It was barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. With a grin, he pushed open the door, revealing a small room unlike the others. The air was damp, and the walls were lined with photographs, each one depicting a family from decades ago. But the faces were blurred except for the eyes, which were perfectly clear. Their eyes glowed faintly red, staring out at the group. As James reached for one of the photos, he felt a cold, clammy hand on his shoulder. Spinning around, he found the room empty. A chill ran down his spine as the door slammed shut behind them, locking itself with an eerie finality. 5. The voice in the attic. Sarah had moved into her dream home, a quaint cottage with a white picket fence. The house seemed perfect, except for the strange sounds she started hearing at night. At first, she thought it was just the house settling, but the noises grew clearer, faint whispering, like a soft conversation coming from above. The attic. Sarah dismissed it, thinking it was just the wind, until one night the whispers turned into clear, desperate voices. "Help! Help me!" Her curiosity piqued. Sarah climbed the creaky stairs to the attic, flashlight in hand. The moment she stepped through the doorway, the temperature dropped dramatically. The dusty room was filled with old trunks and forgotten belongings, but there was no sign of anyone. Yet the whispers continued. The voice became louder and more frantic, now pleading for help. Sarah turned to leave, but as she did, the attic door slammed shut behind her. Panicked, she tried to escape, but the voice, now louder and more distinct, whispered just above her ear, "I'm so lonely." 6. The visitor. Dan worked late most nights at his office, enjoying the solitude. But one evening, as the clock struck midnight, he heard a soft knock on the door. He glanced up from his computer, expecting to see someone from the late shift, but when he opened the door, no one was there. The hallway was completely empty. Shrugging it off as a coincidence, he returned to his work. The knock came again, louder this time, and this time, when Dan opened the door, a cold gust of wind rushed past him. He stepped into the hallway, scanning the shadows for any signs of movement. As he turned to head back to his office, he saw something at the end of the hall. A man standing motionless, his face hidden beneath the hood. He stood there, watching Dan with an unsettling stillness. The moment Dan stepped toward him, the man vanished into the shadows. But Dan's footsteps echoed louder and louder, and as he turned, the man's face appeared in the reflection of the glass doors behind him, grinning. 7. The silent neighbor Ella had just moved into a quiet suburban neighborhood where everything seemed peaceful. Her next-door neighbor, an elderly man, was a reclusive figure. She rarely saw him, but when she did, he would stand at his window, staring across the street without ever speaking a word. One day, out of curiosity, Ella went to introduce herself. She knocked on his door, but the man only peered at her through the crack, his face expressionless. She left, confused, but something didn't sit right with her. The next day, she saw him again, standing at his window, watching her. She waved, but he didn't move. His eyes didn't blink. They just followed her every movement. That evening, Ella heard soft knocks at her door. She opened it, expecting a delivery, but found no one there. However, a small piece of paper was left on her doorstep, scribbled with a single sentence, "I see you." 8. The child's drawing Max had always encouraged his son Luke's creativity, so when Luke brought home a drawing from school, Max praised him. But as he examined the picture, a sense of unease washed over him. The drawing depicted their house, but in the corner was a shadowy figure with glowing eyes, standing in front of their front door. Luke didn't seem frightened, but Max's stomach churned. That night, as they sat in the living room, Max felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He turned toward the door. There, standing in the doorway, was the figure from the drawing. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. Max rushed to the door, flinging it open, but the figure was gone. It vanished into the night, leaving behind only an icy chill. Luke was asleep in his room, but his drawings kept getting darker. That night, a faint knocking echoed from the front door again. 9. The haunted doll Samantha had never been one to believe in the supernatural, but there was something undeniably wrong about the doll her grandmother had given her. It was an old porcelain figure, with delicate features and glassy eyes that seemed to follow her every movement. She placed it in her living room, but soon after, strange things began to happen. The doll would move from its place on the shelf, always positioned slightly differently. One night, Samantha woke to soft giggles coming from the corner of the room. She turned, and there it was, sitting on the edge of the couch, its glassy eyes staring at her with a twisted grin. Samantha screamed and rushed to take it away, but when she reached out to grab it, the doll's head turned sharply to face her. A voice, faint and childlike, whispered from its mouth, "Play with me." Samantha dropped the doll and backed away, but it was too late. The laughter continued, growing louder and more frantic. Point 10. The black-eyed woman Mark had just finished a long day of work when his car broke down on a dark, desolate highway. The night was moonless, and the air was thick with mist. As he stepped out to assess the damage, he saw a figure walking toward him from the distance. At first, he thought it was a hitchhiker, but as she grew closer, Mark felt a chill run down his spine. The woman's face was pale, her hair long and tangled, and her eyes, they were completely black. She didn't speak, but Mark could feel her eyes boring into him. He tried to get in his car, but the door wouldn't open. As the woman reached out to him, Mark bolted, running down the road as fast as he could. He dared not look back. But when he reached the next mile marker, the woman was standing there, blocking his path. Her lips parted, and she whispered, "I've been waiting for you, 11." The lurking shadow. Rachel had always been afraid of the dark, but she was determined to overcome her fear when she moved into her new apartment. At first, everything seemed fine until the nights grew colder. Every time she entered her bedroom, she noticed a dark figure lurking in the corner of the room, always just out of reach of the light. She assumed it was a trick of the shadows or her imagination, but it didn't feel like that. The figure didn't move at first, but it always watched her, its presence more oppressive each night. One evening, as she sat in bed reading, she glanced up and froze. The shadow was no longer in the corner. It was standing by her bedside, leaning in, its cold breath brushing her face. A voice whispered from the dark, You shouldn't have come here. 12. The vengeful bride on a rainy afternoon. Peter and his friends found an old, decaying church on the outskirts of town, hidden deep in the woods. They decided to explore as rumors of a ghostly bride had circulated for years. The legend said she had been jilted at the altar, and in her fury, she had taken her own life in the church. As they entered, they noticed a dusty, abandoned wedding dress hanging on a crooked stand in the center of the room. The air grew colder as Peter approached it. Suddenly, a cold hand gripped his shoulder, and a soft, mournful wail echoed through the church. He spun around, but no one was there. The dress moved by itself, slowly swaying, as if a ghostly figure had just passed through it. Leave before I take you to, a whisper hissed from the shadows. Point 13. The Whistler late one evening, Laura was walking home from her job at the local diner. It was a quiet street, and the street lights flickered dimly. As she walked, she heard a faint sound in the distance, a low whistle, almost like someone calling to her. Thinking it was just another passerby, she ignored it, but the whistling continued, growing louder with each step. She quickened her pace, but the sound followed her, eerily in rhythm with her footsteps. Turning a corner, she finally spotted the source of the whistling, a man standing in the middle of the road, his face obscured by the hood of his coat. As she approached, he stopped whistling and tilted his head toward her. His eyes were empty, nothing but black sockets. "Come closer," he whispered. "I've been waiting." 14. The sound of screams. John had just moved into a small house at the edge of town. It was quiet, peaceful, and the perfect place to get away from the noise of city life. But every night, as the clock struck midnight, he began hearing the sound of muffled screams coming from the walls. At first, he thought it was the house settling, but as the days passed, the screams grew more desperate and violent. He tried everything to stop it. He sealed up the walls, even installed noise-canceling speakers to drown out the sound, but nothing worked. One night, driven mad by the noise, John tore open the wall behind his bed, expecting to find pipes or old wiring. Instead, he discovered a hidden room, and inside, he found a horrifying sight. Human bones scattered across the floor, and a decaying figure shackled to the wall. As he stumbled backward, the figure's hollow eyes locked with his, and the screams began again. This time, they weren't from the walls. They were coming from inside his own head point 15. The watcher in the forestivery summer, Mark and his friends went camping in the same remote forest, but this year felt different. It wasn't the thick fog that rolled in every evening, or the chilly nights that made them uneasy. It was the feeling that someone or something was watching them. On the third night, Mark ventured into the woods alone, hoping to get some peace and quiet. As he sat by the fire, he noticed movement in the trees, something shifting, watching him. He stood up, calling out to his friends, but they were still deep in conversation at camp. That's when he heard it, a soft, raspy voice whispering his name from the woods. As Mark turned, he saw a figure standing just beyond the trees, its eyes glowing faintly. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure stepped forward, revealing a twisted, mangled face. Mark never returned to the campsite. Point 16. The cursed necklace Clara had always been drawn to antique shops, fascinated by the hidden stories objects could tell. One day, she found a necklace in an old shop that caught her eye. The pendant was an intricate gold locket adorned with a strange symbol. The shopkeeper warned her that it was cursed, but Clara didn't believe in such things. She bought the necklace and wore it daily. Soon after, she began having vivid dreams of a woman, pale, gaunt, and with eyes that seemed to follow Clara wherever she went. The woman would appear in her dreams, silently begging for help. But as the days passed, Clara felt more and more drained, as though something was feeding off her energy. One night, she woke to find the woman standing at the foot of her bed, her hand outstretched. "You shouldn't have taken it," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Clara dropped the necklace and ran, but the woman's ghost followed her, never letting her escape. Point 17. The black mirror. When Linda found the black mirror at a yard sale, she was drawn to it instantly. It was a small, oval mirror with a dark, almost unnatural gleam. The seller told her it was an antique from a distant country, and that it was known to show glimpses of things not of this world. Linda laughed it off, thinking it was just a gimmick. But as soon as she hung the mirror in her living room, strange things began happening. Every time she looked into it, she would see flickers of a shadowy figure, always standing behind her. The figure never moved or spoke. It just stood there watching. One night, Linda felt an overwhelming urge to touch the mirror. The moment her fingers brushed the surface, the reflection of the figure reached out and grabbed her wrist. She tried to scream, but the mirror's dark surface seemed to pull her in. Her body went cold as she was dragged into the glass, her final screams fading as the mirror returned to its glassy silence. Point 18. The crying woman late one night. Tommy was walking home from a friend's house when he heard faint crying coming from the alleyway. It wasn't uncommon for people to be out late, so he figured someone was just upset. But the crying grew louder as he approached, and something about it didn't sit right with him. He peeked around the corner and saw a woman sitting on the ground, her face buried in her hands. "Are you okay?" Tommy asked, stepping forward. The woman looked up, her eyes red and swollen, her expression pained. "I've lost my child," she sobbed. Tommy, feeling sorry for her, offered to help. But as he stepped closer, he froze. The woman's eyes, now wide open, were completely black. Her lips parted, revealing jagged teeth, as she let out a low growl. "You shouldn't have come," she hissed before disappearing into the shadows. Point 19. The possession Julia had always been a practical person, so when she inherited an old, ornate mirror from her grandmother, she thought little of it. She hung it in her bedroom, admiring its intricate design. But something changed the first time she gazed into it for more than a few seconds. At first, she thought it was just her reflection that looked off, a slight distortion of her features. But as time went on, she started to notice that when she looked into the mirror, her reflection did not mimic her actions. It moved on its own, smiling when she wasn't, or twisting its face into a look of utter malice. One night, Julia was unable to tear her gaze away. Her reflection's smile grew wider, and its eyes turned black. "You're mine now," it whispered, before reaching out from the mirror and grabbing her by the throat. Point 20. The unseen friend when little Lucy started talking about her friend that no one else could see. Her parents assumed it was an imaginary friend. Lucy's descriptions of the friend were always consistent: tall, pale, and with dark, hollow eyes. But as the days went by, her behavior grew stranger. She would sit for hours, staring at empty spaces in the room, talking to the unseen friend as if it were right beside her. One evening, Lucy came into the kitchen, her face pale and expressionless. "He says I'm not allowed to leave," she whispered. Her parents laughed it off as a phase, but later that night, they heard scratching at the door. When they opened it, there was no one there, but Lucy's voice echoed from the hallway. "He's waiting for you, 21. The door that wouldn't close Samantha moved into an old Victorian house on the edge of town. It was charming, with creaky floorboards and dusty furniture, but there was one thing she couldn't explain. One of the doors in the house wouldn't stay closed. It was an old wooden door that led to the basement. No matter how many times she locked it or pushed it shut, it always swung open by morning. One night, tired of dealing with it, Samantha decided to leave the door open. In the middle of the night, she woke to the sound of footsteps coming from downstairs. Terrified, she crept to the door and peeked inside. There, standing at the foot of the stairs, was a shadowy figure watching her. The door slammed shut behind her, and the footsteps grew louder. She wasn't alone in the house anymore. 22. The dark stair savant had just moved into an old apartment building and noticed that the stairs leading to the top floor were unusually steep and narrow. Most people avoided them, taking the elevator instead. One night, while walking up the stairs after a long day at work, he felt a sudden chill. The air grew heavier as he reached the top, and the light above him flickered erratically. As he turned to leave, he heard a voice, soft but insistent, whispering from the shadows behind him, "Stay with me." When Evan turned around, he saw nothing but darkness. As the light flickered one last time, he felt a cold hand brush against his shoulder point 23. The black cat Megan had always loved animals, so when a small black cat wandered into her yard, she immediately took it in. The cat was quiet and friendly, but its eyes seemed unnaturally large and glistening, almost as if they were reflecting something that wasn't there. Over time, Megan began to notice strange things happening. Her cat would stare into empty corners of the room, hissing at something unseen, and the temperature in the house would drop whenever it was near. One evening, Megan woke up to find the cat sitting on her chest, staring directly into her eyes. "I'm not your cat," it whispered, its voice cold and raspy. The cat's body twisted, revealing a demonic form that clung to her, its claws sinking into her skin point 24. The ghost of the old hotel Max and his friends decided to spend a night in an old, abandoned hotel known for its eerie history. According to the locals, the hotel had been shut down after a series of mysterious disappearances years ago, with no explanation as to what happened to the guests. They entered the hotel with flashlights, their footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. As they ventured deeper into the building, they heard strange noises, soft whispers, creaking floorboards, and the sound of a door opening and closing on its own. At the top of the stairs, they saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was a woman, pale and thin, her long hair obscuring her face. When they called out to her, she slowly turned toward them. Her eyes were hollow. "You're next," she whispered before vanishing into the wall point 25. The red-eyed children Julia had always wanted a large family, so when she moved into a new neighborhood, she was thrilled to meet her new neighbors, a young couple with 3 children. They were all friendly, but there was something off about the children. Their eyes were unnaturally red, and they always seemed to be watching her. One evening, while she was out for a walk, Julia saw the children standing together at the edge of the woods, staring into the distance. As she approached, they slowly turned their heads toward her, their eyes glowing red in the fading light. One of the children stepped forward and whispered, "You shouldn't have come here. We don't let people leave." Julia turned to run, but the children blocked her path, their faces contorting into sinister grins. Point 26. The forgotten room Dylan had always been fascinated by old houses. So when he moved into a Victorian mansion, he thought he'd found the perfect place. The house had been empty for years, and the previous owner's belongings were left behind in an old, dusty room. The room had no windows, and the door was locked. One night, Dylan decided to break the lock and explore it. Inside, he found nothing but old furniture and dusty photographs of people he didn't recognize. But when he looked closer, he noticed something strange. The faces in the photographs seemed to shift, their eyes following him as he moved. Suddenly, the room grew colder, and the door slammed shut behind him. The walls began to close in, and he realized he wasn't alone anymore. The faces from the photos were now in the room with him, their eyes glowing .27. The calling Mirorana had inherited an antique mirror from her grandmother, a beautiful old frame with intricate designs. It had always been in the family, passed down through generations, and her grandmother had told her never to leave it uncovered. But when Anna hung it in her bedroom, she didn't understand the warning. At first, the mirror seemed harmless, but soon she began to feel a presence whenever she looked into it. The reflection would shift on its own, showing strange figures that weren't there when she turned around. One night, as she was getting ready for bed, she glanced into the mirror and saw a hand reach out toward her from the glass. The hand was cold and skeletal, its fingers long and bony. "Come closer," a voice whispered from the depths of the mirror. She tried to turn away, but the mirror's reflection pulled her in .28. The old man's Kurzgesang had never believed in curses, but after moving into an old cottage by the sea, he started to reconsider. The previous owner, an elderly man, had died under mysterious circumstances, and many believed his spirit still haunted the place. One evening, while walking along the beach, Sem discovered a strange, weathered box buried in the sand. Inside, there was an old, yellowed letter that warned, "The curse will follow you." At first, Sem laughed it off, but strange things began happening. Shadows flickered at the corners of his vision. Doors would slam shut on their own, and whispers filled the air. The old man's voice echoed through the cottage, whispering his name. "You opened it, Now you'll never escape. As Sim tried to leave, the walls of the cottage began to close in on him, and he realized the curse had already claimed him. Point 29. The cursed painting Lily had always loved art, so when she found an antique painting at a thrift store, she couldn't resist buying it. The painting depicted a beautiful woman standing in a lush garden, but there was something unsettling about her eyes. They seemed to follow Lily wherever she went. Soon, strange things began happening. Lights would flicker when she was near the painting, and she would hear faint whispers coming from the frame. One evening, Lily decided to clean the painting. As she wiped away the dust, the woman's smile grew wider, and her eyes glowed a bright red. "You shouldn't have touched it," the painting whispered. Lily stepped back in horror, but the figure in the painting stepped out of the canvas, her long fingers reaching for Lily's throat. Point 30. The echoing voice John was hiking alone in the mountains when he stumbled upon an old, forgotten cabin deep in the woods. It was abandoned, the wood rotting, and the windows shattered. But as he explored the cabin, he began to hear something strange, a voice echoing from the walls, calling his name. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but the voice grew louder, more distinct, and more insistent. "John, help me." The voice sounded desperate, almost familiar. He followed the sound to a small room in the back of the cabin, where the walls were covered in strange symbols. As he stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him. The voice whispered again, this time directly behind him. You should never have come. He turned, but no one was there. The walls began to close in, and John realized the voice wasn't coming from outside. It was inside his head. Point 31. The silent witness Maggie moved into an old apartment building, hoping to start fresh after a difficult breakup. Everything seemed normal at first, except for one thing: the neighbor. Every day, around the same time, a tall, thin man would stand in his window across the courtyard, staring directly into her apartment. His face was always expressionless, his eyes hollow. At first, she thought it was just a coincidence, but it soon became unsettling. Every time Maggie moved, so did the man's gaze, as though he was following her every move. One night, feeling brave, Maggie decided to confront him. She went across the courtyard and knocked on his door. When the door opened, a pale, frail woman stood in the doorway, her voice shaking as she whispered, "He's dead. He's been dead for years. You're the one he's been waiting for."
1. The mirror's reflection. Sarah had always loved her old bedroom mirror, an antique passed down from her grandmother. But one night, as she brushed her hair before bed, she noticed something strange. Her reflection wasn't mimicking her movements. The reflection smiled, and Sarah froze. The smile grew wider, more sinister, and then it winked. She stepped back, horrified, but the reflection stepped out of the frame, grinning at her. The glass grew colder, and Sarah could feel icy fingers brushing against her neck. 2. The haunted forced a group of 5 friends, eager for an adventure, decided to hike through a dense, ancient forest they'd heard stories about. As the sun dipped below the horizon, strange noises began to echo between the trees. Whispers, guttural growls, and distant screams. They found an old, decaying cabin and thought it would be a safe place to stay the night. One by one, they vanished, with only the faint sound of their screams carrying in the wind. The last of them tried to run, but the trees seemed to close in, and she could feel hands pulling at her feet. In the morning, the police found only a trail of blood leading to the cabin. 3. The phone call James had just settled down for the night when his phone rang. He was surprised to see the caller ID was his late mother's number. With trembling hands, he answered, "James, don't open the door." His mother's voice whispered, shaky and strained. Panic set in, and James bolted from the couch to the door. His heart pounded as he slowly approached, but before he could reach the handle, he heard a soft knock. The voice on the phone repeated, "I told you not to open it." He froze in place, the knock growing louder, as if whoever was outside knew he was there. 4. The basement shadow Emma had been hearing strange noises in her basement for weeks. Scratching, whispers, and occasional thuds seemed to come from below her feet as she lay in bed at night. After hours of lying awake, she finally gathered the courage to go down and investigate. As she descended the stairs, the air grew unnervingly cold. She reached the basement and flipped on the light, but nothing was there. Just as she turned to leave, she caught movement from the corner of her eye. A shadow darted across the far wall. Her breath caught in her throat as she spun around, but the light flickered out, leaving her in pitch darkness. When she heard slow, deliberate footsteps behind her. She knew she was not alone. 5. The uninvited guest. It had been a quiet, uneventful evening when Laura received an unexpected knock at her door. Upon opening it, she found no one, just a small, unmarked package left on her doorstep. Curiosity overtook her, and she brought it inside. Inside was a photo of her, sleeping in her bed, with a handwritten note that read, "I'm watching." Her heart raced as she checked every window and door in the house, but everything seemed secure. That was until she dared to peek through the blinds and saw a shadowy figure standing across the street, holding the same photograph of her, smiling. 6. The laughing child Anna's old house was always quiet at night, but for the past few weeks, she had been hearing something. Faint, childlike laughter echoing from the attic. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but the laughter grew louder and more distinct, always at midnight. Unable to ignore it any longer, Anna went into the attic to find the source. What she found was a dusty old doll with lifelike eyes staring straight ahead. But as she reached to pick it up, the laughter stopped, replaced by a whisper. "Don't leave me alone." The attic door slammed shut behind her. 7. The empty room. Chris had always been fascinated by the house he bought. An old Victorian mansion with hidden rooms and peculiar designs. But there was one room that no one ever seemed to mention. It was located at the back of the house, with a locked door that no one ever seemed to remember. Curiosity gnawed at him until one day he decided to break the lock and enter. Inside, the room appeared untouched, frozen in time. But on the wall, scrawled in black ink, was a message. "Get out before it's too late." As he turned to leave, he heard a loud thud behind him, and the door slammed shut. 8. The doll's eyes. Emily had never been a fan of dolls, but when she found one at a yard sale, it seemed to call to her. It was an old porcelain doll with strikingly real eyes that seemed to follow her every movement. At night, she would leave the doll on a shelf in her room, but when she woke, the doll was always in a different spot. Its eyes were always watching her. One night, Emily woke up to the sound of soft giggling. The doll was standing by her bed, its mouth twisted into a grin, and its eyes gleaming in the dark. The giggling wasn't coming from the doll. It was coming from beneath her bed. 9. The whispers in the walls. Jake had just moved into an old apartment complex when he started hearing whispers at night. Soft, unintelligible voices seemed to come from the walls. At first, he thought it was the building settling, but over time the whispers grew clearer, as if they were calling his name. Terrified, Jake began to investigate, tapping on the walls, searching for an explanation. When he peeled back the wallpaper, he found the phrase "get out" written in what looked like dried blood. That night, the whispers were louder than ever. But they weren't just in the walls. They were in his room, surrounding him. 10. The light under the bed. Sarah had always been afraid of the dark, but it wasn't until she moved into her new apartment that she truly understood fear. Every night, a strange light would glow beneath her bed. It wasn't from any visible source, just a faint, eerie illumination that seemed to come from the darkness. She would try to ignore it, but one night, driven by an overpowering curiosity, she crawled under the bed. To her horror, she found nothing but empty space. But the light was still there, growing brighter. And then something grabbed her ankle from underneath. The light flickered out, and Sarah was dragged into the abyss. 11. The house on the hill Mark had always been intrigued by the house on the hill, an ancient manor that had been abandoned for decades. But when he finally decided to explore it, he found something far worse than any ghost story. Inside, everything seemed perfectly preserved. Furniture, paintings, even the clothes in the closets. But the house was frozen in time. As he wandered through the halls, he stumbled upon a family portrait. The people in the painting looked disturbingly familiar. As he turned to leave, he noticed them standing in the doorway. They hadn't aged a day since the photo was taken. 12. The footsteps Lily had always been sensitive to sound. So when she began hearing footsteps behind her at night, she thought it was just her imagination. But the steps grew louder, always just behind her, following her through the house. Terrified, she locked all the doors and windows. But the footsteps continued, now echoing from inside the walls. One night, as she walked down the hall, she saw a shadow flicker in the corner of her eye. She turned around, but no one was there. The footsteps stopped. She could feel the cold breath of something right behind her, just before the lights went out. 13. The haunted painting Stephen had always been an art lover. So when he found an old painting at an estate sale, he had to have it. It depicted a woman with haunting, dark eyes that seemed to follow him around the room. As days passed, Stephen began to feel increasingly uneasy in his home. At night, the woman in the painting seemed to move. Her eyes would shift, and her mouth would curl into a faint, mocking smile. One night, Stephen awoke to the sound of footsteps, and when he turned, the woman from the painting was standing at the foot of his bed. 14. The visitor Megan had lived in her apartment for years, but she never encountered anything unusual until one night. She was sitting in her living room when she heard a knock at the door. No one was there when she opened it. Instead, there was a package with no return address. Inside, she found a single photo of her, asleep in her bed. Confused and terrified, she checked all the locks, but as she peeked through the blinds, she saw someone across the street, someone holding that same photograph, with a grin that made her blood run cold. 15. The haunted music box. When Claire found the old music box at a flea market, she couldn't resist. It was beautifully crafted, with delicate engravings and a haunting tune. But when she wound it up, the melody sounded strange, off-key, eerie, and unnatural. Every night after hearing it play, Claire would wake up to strange sounds around her home. Scratching, tapping, and the unmistakable sound of something whispering her name. The music box's song grew louder, and one night, as Claire wound it, the lid opened on its own, revealing a dark figure trapped inside. 16. The forgotten child in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Lily had always noticed the strange child playing outside her window late at night. She would see the child run through the yard, but whenever she opened the window to call out, the child would vanish. One night, she decided to investigate, only to find an old, decaying doll in the yard, its eyes staring lifelessly at her. As she picked it up, she heard a voice from behind her. "I was never allowed to play." She turned around to find the child standing behind her, its face pale and twisted. 40. The forest of forgotten souls. While on a hiking trip, Emily and her friends stumbled into a dense forest that wasn't on any map. It was eerily quiet, and the trees seemed to twist unnaturally. As they ventured deeper, they found an old cabin. Inside, there were dozens of photographs of people who had disappeared in the woods. Suddenly, They heard whispers around them, calling their names. Realizing they were trapped in the forest of forgotten souls, they had to find their way out before becoming another photo on the wall. 41. The mirror's reflection after buying an antique mirror. Mark noticed something strange. His reflection began to move on its own, smiling when he wasn't, walking away when he stayed still. One night, while cleaning the mirror, he accidentally cut his hand. The reflection reached out from the glass and grabbed him, pulling him inside. Mark now lives in the mirror, his reflection still on the other side, smiling at the next person who will try to clean it. 42. The babysitter's call Samantha was hired to babysit for a couple in a quiet neighborhood. The parents gave her strict instructions not to answer the phone. But when it rang, curiosity got the better of her. It was the parents on the other end, urgently asking her to lock all the windows and doors. Confused, she asked why, and they whispered, "We're watching you from the surveillance cameras. The man inside the house with you, he's not supposed to be there." 43. The abandoned hospital. Exploring an abandoned hospital late one night, Ethan and his friends came across old medical records and disturbing drawings of patients. As they made their way deeper into the hospital, they encountered ghostly apparitions of patients who seemed to be stuck in time, reliving their last moments. At the end of the hall, Ethan found a room labeled "The Last Treatment." Inside, the bed was occupied by a pale, still figure. One of his friends, lifeless and staring at him. 44. The vanishing hitchhiker. On a rainy night, Sarah was driving home from a late shift when she picked up a hitchhiker. The man seemed desperate and kept muttering about needing to get home. When she took a wrong turn, he suddenly demanded to be let out. Sarah stopped, but when she turned around, the man was gone, vanished into thin air. Terrified, She drove back home, only to realize her rearview mirror was reflecting the same man standing right behind her in the car. 45. The house on the hill Dan had always been warned about the house on the hill, a mansion abandoned for decades. On a dare, he and his friends decided to explore it. As they entered, the doors slammed shut behind them. They found a large portrait of a family in the entryway, but the faces were scratched out. Suddenly, the portraits began to change. Every face in the picture now had Dan's face. The family had returned to take him as their own. 46. The shadow on the staircase every night. Sam would hear the sound of footsteps coming from the staircase leading to the attic. His wife, Rachel, insisted that the house was quiet, but Sam couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him. One night, when the footsteps became louder, Sam went upstairs. At the top, he saw a dark figure standing just out of view. As he reached out to touch it, it stepped forward, revealing its hollow, glowing eyes. 47. The dolls cursed Maggie inherited a collection of antique dolls from her grandmother. She displayed them proudly, but over time, strange things began to happen. The dolls' positions changed, and Maggie would wake up to find them staring at her. One night, she heard one of the dolls whisper, "You shouldn't have kept us." When Maggie tried to dispose of the dolls, they reappeared in her home, each one more lifelike than before. 48. The picture frame. After buying a vintage picture frame from a yard sale, Robert inserted a photograph of his family. However, every time he looked at the photo, something was different. People in the background would disappear, and shadows seemed to shift. Eventually, Robert noticed that his family members were no longer in the frame, replaced by ghostly figures. The last image showed Robert alone, with a dark figure standing right behind him. 49. The lonely hospital wing when Emily started working at a remote hospital. She was assigned to a long-forgotten wing, closed off from the rest of the building. The nurses warned her not to go there, but her curiosity got the better of her. Inside, she found rooms filled with old, dusty equipment and crumpled sheets. As she wandered, she heard soft whispers and saw shadowy figures at the end of the halls. When she turned to leave, the exit door slammed shut, and the whispers grew louder. 50. The broken clock Cameron had found an old grandfather clock at an estate sale and was fascinated by its intricate design. He set it up in his living room, but every time the clock struck midnight, strange occurrences began. Lights flickered, and the air grew icy cold. One night, when he tried to fix the clock, he discovered a hidden compartment containing an old letter. Once the clock breaks, time will stop for you. The clock's hands suddenly froze, and Cameron realized he was stuck in a loop, living the same moment over and over. 51. The forest echo while hiking with his friends. Max found a strange clearing in the forest, where the trees seemed unnaturally still. As they rested, they heard their voices echo back to them from the trees. But the echoes weren't just repetitions. They were twisted, mocking versions of their words. The trees seemed to close in on them, and soon they realized that the forest was alive, repeating their worst fears in a voice not their own. 52. The hospital ward 13 James had always heard rumors about the cursed ward 13 in the local hospital. Ignoring the warnings, he decided to investigate it at night. As he explored the empty, decaying rooms, he found evidence of experiments gone wrong. Suddenly, he felt a cold breath on his neck, and a figure appeared in the doorway. "You shouldn't have come," the ghost whispered before vanishing into thin air. James tried to run but found himself lost in the labyrinth of hallways. 53. The old woman's warning Lucy was walking home from school when an elderly woman stopped her on the street. The woman told her, "Don't go back home today." Confused, Lucy asked why, but the woman just stared at her, eyes wide with fear. When Lucy got home, she found the house in disarray and a strange symbol drawn on the door. Later that night, the woman's voice echoed from the shadows, warning her again, this time too late to escape. 54. The graveyard watchman late one night, Jacob decided to take a shortcut through an old cemetery. As he walked, he noticed a figure standing near one of the gravestones. Thinking it was a fellow night walker, he approached. But as he got closer, the figure turned and revealed a hollow, lifeless face with eyes that seemed to look straight through him. "You shouldn't be here," the watchman hissed, and the ground beneath Jacob's feet began to crumble. 55. The abandoned amusement park Alex and his friends decided to explore an abandoned amusement park on the outskirts of town. They found the rides frozen in time, rusted and decaying, but still strangely intact. As they explored, they heard eerie laughter coming from the roller coaster tracks. When they climbed into a ride, it began to move on its own, carrying them to a dark, forgotten part of the park. The exit doors were locked, and the laughter grew louder as they realized the park was far from empty. 56. The Curse of the Red Lantern in a Small Village. There was an old legend about a red lantern that would appear on the outskirts of town. Whoever saw it was cursed. Mark didn't believe in superstitions, but one foggy night, he saw the lantern glowing in the distance. He approached it and the light vanished. That night, strange things began happening. His reflection no longer matched his movements, and whispers followed him everywhere. He tried to leave town, but the red lantern followed him, no matter where he went. 57. The phantom train. Emily and her friends were waiting at a small, rural station when they saw an old train pull up on the tracks. It was empty, yet they could hear distant whispers from inside. The train doors opened, and they boarded, thinking it was part of the attraction. As they traveled, the train began to move faster and faster, pulling them toward a destination they couldn't understand. Suddenly, the train stopped, and the doors opened to reveal an endless field. No station, no escape. 58. The sleep paralysis demon. For years, Jason had been plagued by recurring nightmares of a dark, shadowy figure standing at the foot of his bed. Every time he woke up, he couldn't move, frozen by fear. But one night, he woke to find the figure standing beside him, inches from his face. The shadow whispered, "You can never escape." As Jason struggled to scream, the demon's grip tightened, and his body went limp.